Peter Zimborg back at you. Joining me right now on the program is a man who spent 22 years as a producer for The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. He is now the author of Behind the Curtain, an insider's view of Jay Leno's Tonight Show. I welcome to the program Mr. David Berg. David, hello and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
David, 22 years as a producer on what ultimately became the #1 show in late-night television. Wasn't always that way, however. What are your memories of those early days as a producer on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno?
It was a real struggle right from the get-go because Jay was replacing a legend who continues to be a legend to this day, Johnny Carson. And the critics were predicting that, Jay couldn't hold a candle to Johnny Carson. And so at the very beginning, what we were competing with was actually a legend. That was a lot of pressure. And we moved into the same studio that Johnny had used, Studio One, and somehow we always felt Johnny's presence, everybody, including Jay. After about a year, Jay said, we need to move out of this studio. It's just, I know Johnny was still living, but somehow we felt like Johnny was watching over us in Studio One. So we literally moved across the hallway at NBC to Studio 3.
Now, when the show first began, Jay Leno had come from a background of being a guest host on The Tonight Show, as did David Letterman, who ultimately was given his own late-night show on NBC following Johnny Carson. And then after Johnny left and Jay got the job replacing him as The Tonight Show host, David Letterman became competition on CBS, which is still ongoing to this day. Did you guys have competition with David Letterman from the get-go, or was that something that came a little while after?
No, it was huge competition. It was a huge media story. Right from the get-go, right from the time David started, which was about a year after we had gone on the air, and David shot to #1 and stayed at #1 for 2 years. So yes, that was very competitive, and then we had a certain guest that we booked that turned it around.
I'm sure we'll talk about that in just a few moments, but when you guys first started doing the show, and David Letterman first started doing his show opposite one another, did you guys feel the audience was going to be somewhat split? Did you feel that the media portrayal of the situation was anti-Jay, pro-Dave? What was the thoughts from the inside of The Tonight Show at the time?
We felt from the very beginning, and when David actually took over, that the media had always favored David. It's almost like they portrayed David, that it was almost his birthright to assume the mantle of Johnny Carson, and that after all, Johnny had favored David. That is true. However, Johnny was not the decision maker. He was not the great legend he was. It still wasn't up to him to decide who would replace Johnny Carson. That decision was made by NBC.
It seems that the anti-Jay media slant, if you will, existed throughout his entire tenure at The Tonight Show and might still exist to some degree today, though I think it's softened up a little bit towards the most recent transition when Jimmy Fallon was to take over for The Tonight Show.
I think you've called that perfectly. You are absolutely right. And I think when it got to the point where Comcast took over NBC and decided that their guy was going to be Jimmy Fallon, Jay had decided, I've had a really good run. This guy Fallon is very good, and I'm gonna graciously leave the scene, and I'm going to be supportive of Fallon. And I do see a sort of a softening among the critics, and I'm thrilled to learn that Jay is now receiving the Mark Twain Award for American Humor at the Kennedy Center. That's a huge honor.
Huge honor. I know George Carlin got it a few years ago. A lot of other very reputable stand-ups, which ultimately is what Jay Leno is at the end of the day, a stand-up comedian, as much as he'll be known as being a talk show host. When it's all said and done, we're chatting with David Berg, author of Behind the Curtain, an insider's view of Jay Leno's Tonight Show. Now, you mentioned something interesting to me just a few moments ago when you were talking about Comcast taking over NBC and Jay Leno very graciously stepping aside, knowing that Jimmy Fallon would be their guy moving forward as host of The Tonight Show. 5 years or so earlier, when the first transition took place with Jay leaving The Tonight Show and Conan O'Brien taking over, he was also very gracious in his transition of that and allowing Conan O'Brien to take over the Tonight Show, but it came out later when Conan O'Brien's tenure as the Tonight Show host did not work that maybe he was not quite as cool with it as we all thought at the time.
Yeah, I understand that reaction, but let me just clarify that Jay had actually been fired. He was literally fired.
And that's something that didn't come out, I think, at first. At first, Jay Leno went on Tonight Show and announced his retirement when, in reality, he was fired 5 years from that point, right?
Right. You are absolutely right. And I do think that led understandably, to a misperception of what had actually happened. What NBC did, Jeff Zucker, who was in charge at the time, talked to Jay, and they worked out an arrangement where Jay would actually announce that he was stepping down, when in fact he had actually been fired.
What was the personal rapport between Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien leading up to that point? Because when they were guests, respectively, on each other's show, they seemed to have a good comedic rapport with one another. Was there any personal rapport between the two, or strictly business?
No, I think it was there was an environment of cordiality. I do think that really did prevail. But, when you have the Tonight Show, this iconic institution that can only be hosted by one person, stuff happens.
Now, when Conan O'Brien was not working out as host of the Tonight Show, that backlash from the media, that slant of being against Jay Leno, seemed to rear its head once again, if it ever went away completely. What was Jay's thoughts at the time as that whole thing was going down? Did he think that he made any mistakes in how he dealt with it in the media? Because I remember when the rumblings started happening of Conan O'Brien perhaps not hosting Tonight Show anymore, Jay Leno came out and said, well, I'll take it over again if they want me. And I thought at that moment there seemed to be a very big backlash against Jay.
Yes, and I can understand, you're describing this very well. I can understand why there might have been a backlash, but the reality was this. Again, Jay had been fired. Conan took over the show, and within a few weeks, he was before the new Jay Leno show ever went on the air at 10 p.m. Before that ever happened, Conan was already, coming in number 2 to David Letterman within a matter of weeks, and by the end of his 7-month run, he had hemorrhaged about 50% of the viewership. Now, in all fairness, when we did the Jay Leno show, we also didn't do that well in the primetime hour of 10 p.m. So NBC did try to work out an arrangement when it came time, when they canceled the Jay Leno show and had to make a decision about the Tonight Show. They tried to keep both hosts by offering Jay the 11:30 slot and only a half hour, and Conan the 12 midnight slot and for an hour. But Conan rejected that.
I'm asking you about how you felt Jay handled the situation with the media and whatnot. In retrospect, how do you think Conan O'Brien handled the situation? Should he have been more receptive to that idea, or do you think that him parting ways and ultimately going to cable was the right move for him?
I actually, first of all, I think I thought he was a little bit whiny about the whole thing, as if he was, entirely the victim, and sort of implying that Jay Leno was bigfooting and taking his job back. Jay Leno didn't have the power to do any of that. Remember, once again, he had been fired. So I think, but I do think, in the long run, Conan made the right decision, because Conan, in my humble opinion, was never able to appeal to a mainstream audience. NBC executives had been trying to work with him to do that, but still, I believe his humor was a tad bit, a little bit juvenile, a little bit kind of niche, and didn't really appeal to a mainstream audience, and he didn't seem to want to work on that. And now I think he's where he should be, doing cable.
We're chatting with David Berg, author of Behind the Curtain, an insider's view of Jay Leno's Tonight Show. Jay Leno's Tonight Show is in the title of your book. However, you were with Jay even when he did have his primetime experiment.
Right. It's just would have been an awkward title. Right?
It would have been an awkward title to include that in the actual title. In retrospect, why do you think that Jay Leno in primetime did not work? It seemed like it had all the makings of success for NBC moving in, but ultimately it failed.
Well, I actually have to give Jeff Zucker, who was the guy in charge at the time, I have to give him credit for coming up with the idea of doing something to keep Conan O'Brien and Jay Leno, because if Jay Leno had gone over to another network, namely ABC, and believe me, I can tell you from personal experience, ABC was ready to offer him a show going directly against Conan. I don't think Conan would have come out very well under those circumstances.
No, they were willing to get rid of their Jimmy Kimmel for Jay at that time, you feel?
They were ready to move with Jimmy's overt approval. They were willing to move, well, to keep Jimmy in the 12:30 spot.
Now, when Jay Leno was first announcing what he called at the time his retirement, of course we now know he was being fired by NBC 5 years from that point, which is kind of a ridiculous concept when you think about it to even begin with. When that whole situation went down, did NBC feel that over the course of the next few years of him hosting the Tonight Show, he would not be able to hold on to his audience, which at that point put him number one in the late night ratings?
They most definitely felt that way, and on the day that they fired him, and as you properly pointed out, they fired him 5 years prior to his departure date.
What was their logic into thinking that he could not hold on to that audience when he seemingly was on top of the world?
They felt in the long run that Jay wouldn't be able to hold the numbers, and that, you know, Conan being younger was the way to go. And Jay had even tried to work out a deal with him. He said, "Look, let's work this out. So why don't you keep me until the point where I become number two, and then you can fire me." And they had already, by the time they talked to Jay, they had already made up their mind.
Once again, we're chatting with David Berg here, author of Behind the Curtain, an insider's view of Jay Leno Tonight Show. We've spoken a lot about the transition from Jay Leno to Conan O'Brien hosting Tonight Show. When they brought Jay back as host of the Tonight Show, kept him for a few years, and then ultimately replaced him with Jimmy Fallon. I'll be honest with you, when they announced that Jimmy Fallon was going to be taking over for Jay Leno, I remember thinking to myself, this is too soon. The debacle that had happened a few years earlier, a public relations nightmare for NBC, I'm sure, I thought was too fresh in everyone's mind for another Jay Leno transition to Jimmy Fallon to work. In retrospect, I was completely wrong. I think Jimmy Fallon is actually doing an excellent job hosting Tonight Show and really keeping it current with the way television is presented 2014.
Well, I have to tell you, Peter, that when it was announced that Jimmy Fallon was going to take over for Jay Leno, I wasn't really fond of Jimmy. I really wasn't. I didn't want to like him. And then when I started watching him, I thought, hey, this guy's really talented, but I still don't like him. And as time went on, I'm going, no, this guy has a positive attitude. He's uplifting. He's just what America needs right now. He has now taken the concept of late-night television and brought it to the next level. He's made it a performance. It's almost like watching kind of a mini version of Saturday Night Live every night. And so now I'm a big fan of Jimmy Fallon.
Now, when Jay's Tonight Show was conclusively winding down for the second time for good, there were jokes thrown in there. Well, you know, maybe I'll be back, and everyone would laugh knowing that he had left and come back once before. How much of that was joke, and how much of that had an inkling of truth to it to you folks who worked at The Tonight Show?
I think there was, and let me just say that I wasn't there until the very end. I had left a couple of years early because I wanted to do a book about this incredible, iconic institution. But anyway, I kept in close touch and often went down to the studio and went to the show. So I do think that Jay was, I think he was disappointed, and I think there was some truth in the jokes, because it's almost like you have a championship fighter. He's in the ring, and in the fourth round, he's pummeling the opponents. In his last year on the air, Jay Leno, his ratings skyrocketed like 25 to 30%. And again, it's like a championship boxer. You're done with the fight. You've lost, right? I think it was a huge disappointment. So I do think there was a grain of truth in some of the jokes.
Now, you mentioned that Jay Leno's ratings skyrocketed in his last year on the air. When he first came back after what we'll call the Conan situation, what were his ratings like at that point? Did he have a hard time going up against Dave initially, considering that there was some public perception to be against him?
within 1 month, he took the ratings. Again, Conan had hemorrhaged 50% of the audience. He made up for those 50% and then added audience, bringing it up to a total of 4 million from from way down in the 2 million level. And I believe TV Guide called it miraculous what he did, and he did that within 1 month.
Was it awkward coming back for you guys? Because I remember his first episode back, and you guys brought out, I think Jamie Foxx was the guest. And it was Jamie Foxx, and all of a sudden the band starts playing that Black Eyed Peas song, Tonight's Gonna Be a Good Night, and Jamie Foxx is just going, Tonight's gonna be a J night, and the crowd got into it, but you're thinking to yourself, like, oh, is this forced? This is kind of awkward, but I see what they're trying to do.
Well, it was awkward. It was a tad bit forced. You're absolutely right. Because, again, as you pointed out correctly earlier in this interview, the press had never, ever, and I don't mean the press in general, I mean the television critics in general, just were not a fan of Jay. And they were particularly unfair to him when it came to Conan, implying, in fact, that Jay bigfooted Conan and took his job back. So we were under enormous stress and pressure going back to the Jay Leno show. And yes, that was particularly a tense week.
Now, the first time he left the Tonight Show, he did a thing where he brought out all of the kids who had been born from staff members over the years, and he was smiling and everything was cool. I think because he knew that, hey, I'm just going to be on, a few hours earlier in a few weeks. What the hell does it really matter? When he left the second time, leaving for good, with him giving the Tonight Show over to Jimmy Fallon, he seemed much more emotional and actually started to begin to crack emotionally during that final episode. What was Jay's honest feelings towards that being the end?
I was in the audience that night. As I said, I had left the show a couple of years early. But I was in the audience, and I witnessed it in the audience, and I saw him backstage, and I was there at the wrap party. And yes, it was a very, very emotional time. But by that time, he had, I think he had accepted the fact that he had done his run at the Tonight Show and he was ready to move on. And I love the way he described, because this was absolutely genuine, that over time, the people at the Tonight Show had actually become his family. And he meant that literally. Now,
describe your role working with Tonight Show with Jay Leno for all those years. You're a producer. Describe for our listeners what exactly that means.
As you know, producer is a very nebulous term. It can mean anything in Hollywood. But at the Tonight Show, it's pretty specific. What I did is I booked guests, and I worked with the guests, producing their segments. In other words, coming up with topics to talk about. In my case, all of the producers kind of specialized in their own areas. In my case, I had a news background. I had worked for NBC News for many years. And so my emphasis, my big push was to bring people, not just entertainers that Johnny Carson had primarily done, but to bring newsmakers on the show, presidential candidates, athletes, people like that.
While we're talking about guests booked on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, as that was your forte as you were a producer there, let's talk about the difference between guests on Jay Leno's show and the current incarnation of The Tonight Show, hosted by Jimmy Fallon. For many years, Jay Leno, I think through his entire tenure as host of The Tonight Show, kept up a Tonight Show edict set by Johnny Carson that Joan Rivers was not to be allowed as a guest in the show, based upon Johnny Carson feeling that at one point she had been disloyal to him and The Tonight Show brand. Within months of Jimmy Fallon taking over The Tonight Show, she was on his show. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts about that, I believe what, and I'm not faulting you for what you said, because that's exactly what the report said. But that really came from Joan Rivers herself. The reason we didn't have Joan Rivers on the show is because, in our opinion, she wasn't a good guest. She wasn't really relevant.
And it's interesting to say that she wasn't relevant then, but maybe she's relevant now, perhaps through social media and Twitter, for example. She's well followed on that social media. She's made herself relevant once again, if she wasn't at the time Jay Leno was hosting The Tonight Show. And I'm not saying she was or wasn't.
Well, I actually agree with you. I think now she is relevant. I believe that she has reinvented herself.
What did you think about Kim Kardashian appearing on the last Tonight Show with Jay Leno and then the first Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon? Was there any sense of disloyalty there, or is that just Kim being Kim?
Not at all. That's Kim being Kim. And, she's really good at promoting herself, and she also happens to be kind of attractive.
Kind of attractive? She's hot, my friend. You can say it. It's okay. We're chatting with David Berg, author of Behind the Curtain, an insider's view of Jay Leno's Tonight Show. In all your years producing guests at the Tonight Show with Jay Leno, who is your favorite and who is your least favorite?
Favorite guest?
Yes.
My favorite guest happened to be also Jay Leno's favorite guest.
And who would that be?
John F. Kennedy Jr.
John F. Kennedy Jr., before he passed away, of course, in the late 90s. And why was he your favorite guest?
Well, first of all, you especially like someone that's hard to get, I think. It took me 6 years to book him. And we're talking about a guy that means and meant so much to America. We're talking about American royalty in a way that no other person represented. And we're also talking about, at least for Jay's generation and my generation, his father being assassinated as a young president we all looked up to. And so we all carried that, Jay and I carried that around with us. So when I started trying to reach out to JFK, that's what was prominent in my mind. But again, it took me 6 months to get him because he didn't think he was good enough to be on the show. He thought, why would anyone have any interest in watching me? What do I have to say that people want to see? Which made him all the more appealing.
At what point did he ultimately decide to come on your show? Was it when he had that political magazine for a while?
Yes, that's how there were two ways that I got to him. One, when George magazine came out, and it was a big struggle. It was a risky venture that he was doing with George magazine. Kind of a combination of Washington and entertainment. So I appealed to him that way, and I also appealed to him through his assistant, Rosemary. I'm going to get her name wrong. But anyway, she was wonderful, and she was a big fan of Jay Leno, and she went to bat for me on my behalf, pushing her boss to do.
Special thanks goes out to David Berg, author of Behind the Curtain, an insider's view of Jay Leno's Tonight Show. That book is available in bookstores everywhere and at Amazon.com.